Okay, so we'll start with your assignment for today. Um, but as you look at the assignments, don't forget that I have put the notes on the note pages. So when you look at your week or your day, um, your notes are the first page. So when you look at the module, if you want to download it, you can. You can view it inside the page. It's already embedded. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about Windows operating system. So 80% of the business uses Microsoft products one way or another. As far as cloud product, they are the leading compared to also AWS, which is Amazon Web Services. So the two main cloud that you're going to see for infrastructure, that means that people run server at a remote or server machines, using server machines remotely from either Azure, which is Microsoft, or you can use AWS. And AWS also allow you to have instances that are Microsoft oriented, meaning that you can have virtual machines that are hosting your web services, Linux to Windows. So AWS EC2 allows you to run virtual machine, and they have various versions of Windows like server and client. So we're going to talk about that today. So if you want to check out the notes, you can, and that's going to probably help you understand a little bit more about the assignments. So in Microsoft operating system, so to really define operating system is a software that allows you to interface with the PC. The Windows PC is, it's really geared for Microsoft environment, right? The PC. And it allows you to create files, access resources. So the operating system as a whole, gives the user the experience in interfacing with the system. It's typically an operating system would include file management, which is what you see as file explorer. So if you're looking at your desktop right now, right, your file management is typically the little folder icon, and that allows you to navigate to where you save the file, or even the drives that you have. And over a different version, you would see that the interface slightly changed, in variations for the features that it's equipped with. But all operating systems have specific file system. And Microsoft compared to Linux, or Apple, right? They all have variation of file system. So for Microsoft file system, it's a structure for the operating system to be able to store files. So your system files can be things from like running resources and services for internet connection, applications, communications, hardware devices that you attach to regular user files that is belonging to this structure, which is the file system. So the original file system that Microsoft came up with was FAT, which is known as FAT. And FAT was really designed for cross-platform. So all your USB drives typically is formatted with file allocation table, which is FAT. Now, FAT was adapted for the 8-bit and the 16-bit system, which is the legacy, as you can see, with Windows 95, Windows 98, and eventually became XP, right? And then Windows 7. So those are still the predominant one. When I came into the field, I was the technician and then eventually doing networking. Windows NT was predominant for the networking part. So in operating system, you have a client operating system, which typically is like a desktop Linux or Apple. That is your Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows 7. And then you have the server version, which is your server right now. Currently, they're running 2022, right? So the server version has more capability in providing services, hence the name server, such as authentication, right? Or even, managing user accounts, like who can log into my network, etc. But yes.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask with Linux, isn't it a different way to access the file? So like you don't just open up like a file manager, like it's kind
You
of
can.
but
I think all the current versions, all the current releases, especially Debian or even others, you can. There's a file manager and you can navigate to, and they call it file system technically. So, later on, if we have time, I can show you what that looks like. But so you're able to navigate. So it has a graphical user interface, but unlike Windows only have one form of desktop.
Yeah.
Linux have multi-variation of desktop, right?
Yeah, correct.
So the file system is a way that the computer can identify the location of the file. And Linux have different file systems compared to Windows. So file allocation table, the way it's designed is it's like this. When you create a file, that file is saved to an address, right? Just imagine that like you put a file into a house on your street. And what the system does is it tracks that address. It puts that address onto a list, a table, okay? And the way that it finds the file when you trying to open the file is it goes to that table and it's gonna see where that file is. But remember, we talk about dynamic storage. Your file, for example, myhomework.doc, is not in one location, even though it's a tiny file, right? Let's say that my file is only 1 MB, which is kind of small in today's world, right? So what happens is your computer distributed your file into many areas. So just imagine that you have to move all your items, right? Into one room. But instead of putting it in one location, what you do is you're gonna put it in the hallway, you're gonna put it in different areas so that way you can quickly grab it as you move across the house. So the system, what it does is it spreads out that file into multiple addresses. And it uses a table to map where that file is when it needs to open. And this happens to be instantaneously for the user, right? Just imagine back in the day when you open the file, it takes a little bit longer because the processor was slower. But what the processor does is it takes those addresses from the table and it reads those addresses. And then once it knows those addresses, it's going to then fetch it from those addresses. Just imagine pulling different things from different areas of your home into one area. And that's how it's able to pull the file. Now, the 32 here just indicates that it's 32 bits for the 32-bit software, which is what you see post Windows XP or at the end of XP, going into Windows 7 and now 10 and 11. But throughout time, since Windows NT, Microsoft came up with another file system. This is predominantly used in Windows 11 and 10 and all the server versions now, which is called NT file system or new technology file system. The way this works is it's not a table format, right? It does have some features in such that you can compress, you can encrypt, you can right click the file and be able to set options. So for example, right, here's my USB drive. I can go to the property sheets of my file or folder. And in a regular user environment, you would see more tabs than this because you have higher privilege. Okay. You have access to control your file a little better because I'm logged into the network. But you would have a tab called security. And in that, you can control who can access your file. And that was the reason, the primary reason that NTFS is currently used today. It is a way for us to control the access of components in the file system, right? Including services, drivers, etc., for the hardware and the software. So what you see is, and so file technology or a new technology file system is predominantly now in the current version. Okay. Now, if let's say that your parents had Windows XP and then they upgraded their computer and then they got Windows 7 and now Windows 10 and Windows 11. Let's say that instead of using NTFS, I use FAT32. And I stuck with FAT32 all the way until 64-bit. So what they did was they had to find a way for one file system to be upgraded to the newer software. So exFAT is now also being used on USB or flash drive or storage technology, and exFAT simply is FAT64. Okay. And that is integrated for the upgrade from FAT32 into the newer bit size. So the higher the bit size, incrementally, you're able to have more instructions to be able to accommodate for the software. So that's why we increase from 32-bit to 64-bit for all platforms, Linux, Windows, Mac, etc. Right? And then CDFS is for your CD, right? Your optical drive. So optical drives like DVD and CD uses a file system also. And that file system is structured so that way the actual disk can store files, right? Like songs, movies, even documents, and so on. Okay. And I'm not gonna go into a Linux type of file system because that's probably gonna take a whole class to kind of structure that. But I can show you what that looks like. I have Linux virtual machines, and we can look at that later. So when you are talking about partitions, it is basically sections of your drive. Okay. So if I have a solid state drive, 2 TB, what I can do is I can section that drive just like a house. You can divide up the house into many rooms, and each room has its functionality, such as a living room, right? A family room, a dining room, and so on. So the way that we divide up the logical partition is that we take a drive that has capacity in a certain size, right? You can have 4 TB, 1 TB, 500 gig, depends on the actual physical capacity. And what we can do is we can section it just like how you divide up your house. Your entire house might have 2,000 square foot, right? Square feet. And then you can divide up the family room as the biggest room in the house, or the living room is the biggest room in the house. So it really depend on the user or the organization on how they can logically section up the drive. However, the limitation in how you section it is going to depend on your file system. So if you're using FAT32, the maximum, the biggest room in that drive is 2 TB, no more. This was because the FAT32 was implemented at the time where 2 TB was out of reach for most part. Only you see this in servers environment, but typically we don't use FAT32 for server. However, so just think about that, right? Let's say that in your house, there's a requirement that you cannot have the largest room more than 200 square feet. Okay. So that's the maximum. So whatever room that is, the master bedroom, the dining room, whatever room that is, it's going to be limited to that size. So the way that Microsoft designed their operating system is that if you use FAT32 for Windows 7 or XP, you cannot have drives section that is bigger than 2 TB. Because back then, 1 terabyte was kind of almost impossible because it's not in the market, right? So they made it where you can have a very large section of your drive for your operating system because operating system back then, you just need 50 gig to run OS, and that's plenty. Okay. So when we install today, I'm going to touch back on this. Now, if you format your USB, or let's say that I order from Amazon and I give it to you guys and you plug it in, right? USB is formatted with FAT, EXFAT or FAT32. The reason why is that FAT is compatible with all OSs. So the industry, they had agreed that all operating system except FAT, right? Mac, right? If you're using an Apple, you plug the USB in, it works. If you use Linux, you plug the USB in, it works, right? Windows, it works. So if you want to change your USB to NTFS, then what will happen is you can only use it in Windows system. So it's kind of like you tell your family members we are only going to speak a certain language when we're at home, so that's the only thing that you are going to use in that household that's strictly for that family, right? So if we use the file system that's pertaining to the vendor, then it's only going to be used for that vendor. Okay, so FAT is compatible across the board. Now, in a 32-bit environment, you still see a lot of 32-bit systems around. Not everybody upgrades at the same time. So in different parts of the world, they don't have access to technology like we do, right? So if you go to more of a country that doesn't have a lot of technology resources or supply, what happens is you're still going to have 32-bit software and 32-bit system. So the 32-bit is really tied back to the hardware. So your processor is only capable of understanding 32-bit instructions, whereas now your new processors is capable of 64-bit, and the word sizes are different at the low level. So if I'm using a 32-bit Windows 7, right, I can have the maximum of memory I can have is 4 gig. So I had, throughout time, I've seen a lot of students game, and a lot of the games are really made for PC because predominantly that's the market, right? 90% of the gamer owns a PC if they're a PC gaming outside of console, right? And they want more RAM because RAM gives you the capability to run application like what we talked about. But when people trying to sell you, right? Let's say that you go into Best Buy 10 years ago and you say, I want to buy a laptop. And they would say, you know what, here's a laptop that comes with 8 gig of RAM and it runs Windows 7. So you think to yourself, okay, 8 gig of RAM is going to allow me to run some application. That's good. Extra is okay. But your operating system only going to need 4 gig. It's like 3.96. So back then for the 32-bit operating system, if you still run 32-bit, your OS maximum capacity for RAM is only 4 gig. So this is why you see the transition in system being sold from 4 gig to 8 gig, and it took a long time. It's because hardware is really accommodating software. It always goes together in this industry, right? So when you buy hardware, you think about software. When you buy software, you think about hardware. And that's how it works. Okay? So if you buy excess, it's good, but you don't really absolutely need it because that's the maximum amount. Now, with 64-bit, which is known as EXFAT, why didn't they call it FAT64? I don't know. Maybe it's just too long. They call it EXFAT, like for extended FAT, right? So so if you use FAT64 or EXFAT, the maximum volume capacity, the largest drive, like let's say C drive or D drive or F drive, is going to be 512 terabyte. That's huge, right? So if you think about that, I mean, in large server data center environment, that might not be too big because you have a lot of people using the storage. But for a regular user, do I really need 512 terabyte drive? Can I really have that in my system? Technically, no, because you opened the desktop yesterday, right? If you have solid state drive, you probably have 2 slots. And the maximum drive that capacity that you can get that's affordable is about 4 terabytes. So if you get 2 drive, that's 8 terabytes, right? Some people I know have 12 or 32 excessive. That's good if they are streaming movies from their computers, etc. That's fine. But what Microsoft did is they put a number of maximum capacity, assuming that the user will not reach it in the lifetime of that OS. Okay. So 512 terabyte is the maximum volume size if you're using FAT64. So basically file allocation table for 64-bit software, right? But theoretically, mathematically, you can increment it, and they say that if you calculate that out, it should be up to 64 zettabyte, which is exponentially a lot bigger. So the way that they design exFAT is it's really supposed to last a long time. Why do we care if we're not using it in Windows environment? We care because your flash drive technology, a lot of the storage is using exFAT. Okay. And eventually we will get here because, there's a term called big data and there's a reason why we call that, right? Yes. Do you have a question? If they turn it in, it will be up here. If not, um, maybe the class in the morning they might have taken, but I can ask them shelter. Yeah, if they turn it. I'm sorry. There's one up here, but it's been here since last semester. If you need one, I can give you one. I know you have stuff on it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can ask them. Sometimes, people turn it into police for lost and found. You can check with them when you leave. I have some extra ones, so you want one. Okay, so we understand that. So I wanted to kind of break it down and tell you that a zettabyte is a billion terabyte, right? That's a lot. But in a data center sense, combining all the storage together, a billion terabyte might not be too big at all, right? So if you're looking at enterprises like Meta or Facebook, Instagram, right? The amount of storage that they go through to be able to host, social media is a lot, right? Everybody's video shorten or long, right, can be megabytes, and incrementally you have millions of people using it. So it's a lot. Okay. So it's really designed for drive to go a lot longer because, they look into the future. Yeah.
What did they do before data centers were around?
We had servers. So cloud is just a new coin term. So before so back in the day, the servers were like mainframes because it uses a little bit different hardware technology and operating system, like IBM and other So IBM still have their own type of servers for a certain type of enterprise system business, and so on. But so if you're looking at a bank, like Bank of America, they've been around for a long time. You would see that they have mainframes and they own their mainframes, which consists of groups of servers, right? Or a big server. And then be able to process all the transaction and things like that. And then that gets connected through the network with all the ATM machines. And then throughout time, Microsoft started releasing their server operating system, which is later on, it caught on, starting from Windows NT and then Windows 2000, 2008, 16, and eventually now you have 2022. I think there is a new version coming out, but not everybody upgrade because every time you roll an upgrade, things are likely going to fail. You have to install different, troubleshoot different drivers and different things. So they don't always push the upgrade with software. So when I say upgrade, it's like you going from Windows 10 to Windows 11, right? Update is when you update to the next version of the software, which is not an upgrade. Update is kind of like patching the software. You can go from like 1.25 to 1.26. So that you just basically have the fixes. Okay. So the system that you see from a consumer standpoint, this is client operating system. In Linux, we call that desktop, compared to server, right? So Windows 7 and onward was accommodated for FAT64 or exFAT. Now, Windows 8 was kind of like a lost version. I think they push it, and during the time of Windows 8, tablets became really popular. So they did Windows 8 as a mobile version, but it turns out that Windows 8 consumed a lot more RAM compared to Windows 7. So a lot of the corporate or the enterprises, they kept Windows 7, they skipped Windows 8, and then they went into Windows 10. Microsoft recently announced that they stopped supporting Windows 10. So when they say when they stop supporting Windows 10, what does that mean? They stop fixing the security issues on it. They stop modifying the software so that way it can, reduce some of the problems that you have. They transitioned to Windows 11, which is Windows 10X, right? At Windows 10, Microsoft announced that we're not gonna up the number anymore, but then they changed it later on. So will there be a Windows 12 or 13? It will probably be a 10X. So what they did was they took 10 and they added some feature, modified some of it, and then call it 11. This is a way that they can sell software. Okay, so, but if they stop at Windows 10, there's no more business, right? I mean, if you're in business, you're always going to have to make more profit. So you have to find ways to get people to install. So if you stop supporting this, they have to go to the next one. And and the decision in that is that some over time, you don't want to keep going back and fixing a lot of the old problem because technology change, hardware change, right? 11 might have more AI components, and then the next version and so on is really moving forward with the need and the demand for the user with the current technology. Okay. So as you know, right, Windows is a proprietary product. That means that you have to pay for the license. There are open source products, right, like Linux. So for example, in cybersecurity, I teach my student how to use Kali Linux with a K, and it is an open source or Debian release. So those developer, they build the operating system for everyone to use as long as you don't make a profit out of it. So if you use it for your environment, like let's say I use it for work, right? Like to host web servers and so on. Some of the licenses, you have to look at the license. You have to ask them for permission if you are using it for profit. Okay. But the proprietary operating system are like Windows. Mac OS is a proprietary. It's really designed for that company and their systems, and you have to pay for the license. You'd be surprised on the amount of money that goes into software, right? Like how you log on to the network, right? That simple authentication process, they have to the school district college district has to pay for the license by the user. Okay, very similar to Adobe product. So when we buy server operating system license, Microsoft would ask, how many users are you expecting to have? So let's say I say 4,000 users, then we pay the seats, right? So each user costs a certain amount, and the more users you have, a little bit more discount you get. So you get like a bulk license for all your user. So this is why whenever you upgrade, they up the fee, and then that's why companies don't always upgrade all the time. So Mac OS, like the old Catalina, is that. So you see Windows and Apple, those tend to be like the proprietary. Linux, there's some Linux that are proprietary. Red Hat Enterprises, they made it free for education, but if you use Red Hat, you have to also pay for seats license. And then you got Fedora, which is different. So there's many variation of Linux that are free. So the majority of the web servers that exist in this world, right? Approximately 900 million websites, on a little bit more or less, right? Those servers run Linux because of the licenses. Just imagine you have to pay for every user that lands on your website. No, that's crazy, right? Can you run it on your Windows? Yeah, once you already paid the license, you can run the service, which is IIS. So, any question?
Yeah, for the Windows 10, so 11 would be automatically closed.
Yeah, so if you have Windows 10 on your laptop right now, right? Microsoft always prompt you on the right side, do you want to upgrade? I highly recommend that you back up your files before that process because it's supposed to not corrupt your file, but you never know, right? 70% of the time that possibility exists. So yeah, back up your essential file to cloud or external hard drive and then go through the upgrade. So that's important. Okay, I'm going to move 7 down so we can see it on the next page together with 8. So the current one that you see, most companies still keeps Windows 10. Have they gone Windows 11? Not yet, right? So they're going to wait a couple of years. Why so? Because the fixes already occurred, right? In security, we already know that there's 0 day, right? That means that even at before the launch of the software, they already know the weakness of your software. So potentially, they can break your system. So, so you kind of have to plan ahead. You're like, okay, I want to deploy Windows 11 for all my users. And when you're looking at enterprises like Walmart, they are worldwide, right? They don't just have like terminals that might not be running Windows, but they have people, employees that have desks and, desktop workstations and laptops and so on, right? Executives. So what you see is the majority of the business uses Microsoft products because they have to, because other businesses use Microsoft products. So if you have your files in Microsoft product and you send it to your, distributor, right? You have to use another software to convert it, like Adobe to PDF, right? Or you have to check with them what kind of software you're using. So there has to be a way. So this is why what you see is the span of Microsoft products is wide. So, the emphasis is that if you are going to go into this industry, the IT and the cybersecurity industry, you have to be well versed in Microsoft products, and you have to be well versed in Linux, right? You're going to see a lot of Windows administrators, right? Because it's just more popular. You're going to see a lot more virus in Windows because it's just more popular. There's more demand in the product itself, right? Compared to Linux. Because that's always the argument, like, oh, there's no malware in Apple system. That's a lie, right? Android, if you read any kind of news about malware, that's picking up, right? Android systems are being highly impacted. I think it's increased by 60%, 70%. So now if you're looking at Chrome OS, which is like browser based, but if you're looking at Android system, it's Linux in the back, right? It's embedded Linux. So a lot of these operating system, it really stem from Linux. But did you know iOS or Mac OS is stemmed from Unix and Linux, right? There's a terminal It's the same in Linux, right? Some commands are the same, right? So Apple just took the product and modify it and customize it to their own. Okay. So that's how you have it. So in the mobile environment, you are going to have slightly different features, and because of the limitation in the hardware, your processor is slightly different, right? Your screen size is different. Your board on a tablet is slightly different than your regular PC. So they have to create operating system that accommodates to that. I hate it when I go to a website and they don't make it for mobile, right? Like it's all out of span and you kind of have to zoom in and out, right?
Yeah.
People don't do that anymore. That's a very easy, simple, automated process. But just imagine that if you had to use your regular Windows OS on these devices, it would be really difficult. So if you're running Windows 10 mobile or Windows 10, now they call it IoT, I forgot the version. You can run it, if you buy a Surface, it has that variation, but you can also install other. So it depends on the level of Surface that you buy. Because of the hardware, you can have Windows 10 or 11 Pro on it, right? But it's really accommodated to the hardware. Okay. Okay, any question? Okay, yes, you have a question?
Kind of more of a comment, I guess. I know you talk about gaming a lot. My friend that showed me Linux, that's the only reason why I know about it. He says the only thing that sucks about it is like some programs you can't run like games specifically or stuff like
Yeah, and then if you buy things like USB adapt device, like wireless adapter or maybe a speaker, some releases don't have the generic driver built in, so you have to make your own driver, right? So Linux is really made for developer.
Yeah.
But they are making it a lot easier to use now. So if you like to explore Linux, right? I'm gonna give you some resources for this.
Yeah.
Right? I mentioned yesterday, Ubuntu is probably the most friendly version. And if you want to not install it on the computer, just buy a flash drive. I think at least 8 gig. And then you can just go search for live USB. Okay. Ubuntu have instructions for you how to make it. Okay. But you can only run this if you're capable of configuring the boot for your computer. Okay, you can't do it here because they lock it where you cannot boot to. If they allow it, it will be a security issue because someone can plug that in and run a bunch of script on their network. No, right? So if you search for Ubuntu Live USB, it kind of walk you through on how to make it step by step, really easy, right? 6 gig or bigger, right? Like the one I gave you is 16. That's plenty. But once you make that USB a live USB, you cannot use it for other things. Understand? It has an image for the system. It has a boot sector, all of that. So you can just stick it into your computer, right? And then you select the option to boot to it. So when you press the power and boot, you're going to see Linux instead of your typical Windows environment. So this is a really cheap way to explore Linux. And, if you're using Linux, it's really good to learn command line, right? There's lots of tutorials. So I always walk my students through the basic, stuff that they need for IT and cybersecurity. So it walks you through. But this is, a good resource. Yes. Question?
Yeah, just to pick back on this question. So instead of using the flash drive, can you just put it on the partition?
So okay. Making a dual boot is like Windows next to Linux. You can't. Okay. I'm gonna give you a really good piece of advice. Watch many tutorial and do your research, because even if you follow things to the T, Linux likes to take over. So, you have to modify your boot priority along with, like, there's a little script that you run. But or you can run a virtual machine, right? There's virtual machine that you can download and run it, So virtual machines is like we use the software to simulate another system, right? That's called a hypervisor. But So there's tons of options. Many companies run virtual machines. So my students are like, ew, virtual machine, I don't like it, right? But you are gonna have to work with it. This is the nature of the industry, right? Like, why buy another computer when you can simulate it, right? So,
Thanks.
yep. Yeah, so there's many ways. So if you want to download and install, you can go to the same website. Sorry, you guys, real quick, right? You can go to Ubuntu and search for download. You want the desktop. That's like Windows 10 and 11. If you get the enterprise or the server version, that's for their server system. Like if you're hosting like web or something like that, right? So if you go here, I typically, so you're gonna download this one, the Intel AMD, that's for your PC. If you run a Raspberry Pi, that's ARM. Okay. ARM is equipped. Did you know that prior to your M1 and M2 in Apple systems, they were using ARM? So ARM is like for your Android tablets, your Raspberry Pi, so you can run Linux on your tablets as well, or even your phone, right? But hey, guess what? You have an Android phone, that's a Linux system. Okay, so you can go through, and I normally like the LTS. It's just it has a lot less stuff, but you can get a full blown with everything a little bit more
So,
in.
Professor, if the software is free,
Yes.
open source, how does the company make money?
So the developers, they are either funded by certain sources. There are sponsors and people that contribute. Sometimes they take donation. A lot of places that you would see donate here, right? So that way it would pay. But a lot of open source product becomes proprietary product in that they add a few more features and then they sell it as a better software. You see a lot of that in security. But you have to really look at the licenses, because if you use open source, like I said, for profit, sometimes it can come back and sue you, right? You just gotta make sure that you understand the license, and sometimes you have to ask them for permission. So did you know that if you have a Raspberry Pi, right? You buy it now, it's $100. It used to be only $60. You use it for how to learn, to code and so on. That's good, right? You make a few projects like smart thermostat for your home. That's good. But if you start monetizing from the Raspberry Pi, such as, buying a Raspberry Pi, make it into a device to sell, that's a violation, right? And you have to ask their permission, because the way that they make the boards, the license is strictly open source for cheap, and their OS is used for that. You can download it freely. It's not for profit. Okay, so you have to ask their permission. There's some boards that you can use
And they give
for
it
that
to you?
purpose. So it depends on your intention.
Make money.
But what kind, right? Like, so if you're gonna build an empire out of it, probably you're gonna have to pay them some fee.
Nobody knows. Like Facebook didn't know.
Well, do you want to build an empire and then get sued for bankrupt, right? So, software is a crazy thing. So anyway, for scenario number 11, a client has Windows, let's say Windows 10 or Windows 7 Home 32-bit. For on the desktop computer, and he asks you, right, to install newer operating system. So if you're going from Windows 7, you're gonna go to 10 Home. If you're going from 10 Home, you're gonna go into 11 Home. Okay, so there's what's called edition. So editions is kind of like different models in cars, right? So you might be familiar with a car. So if you want to buy a car, it has the minimal, right? It has the steering wheel, maybe AC, key, wheels, motor, drive, right? Or you can buy a car, that same brand car, same like a compact car, but luxury, right? Like leather interior, navigation system, all of those things, right? So edition is like that. So the home is the most stripped down version. It has really designed for regular user for home use. Somebody connect to the internet, check email, use browser, et cetera, okay? Now, and then you have the education version, which is a little bit better than home. And then you have the pro version, which is have more administration or configuration capability. That's really made for business. And then before, they used to have an enterprise version, but now they did away with it. Now they just stuck with pro. But so if you see that, that's just have more features, more tools to be able to configure your system.
Professor,
Yeah.
in your class notes, you say that you have to upgrade. If you're upgrading from 7, you upgrade from 7 home to
10 home.
8, and then 8.
No, you don't need to. You can, as long as the file system is the same, and as long as your hardware meets the minimum requirement. Yeah, you don't have to go sequential. Yeah, you can skip a release, go to the next one. As long as your file system is the same and as long as the edition is the same. Can I go from home to pro? You can technically, but you're gonna have to pay more. So the most efficient and economical upgrade is to go from home to home because the hardware is going to really accommodate to that. Pro requires a little bit more hardware, like more RAM, more hard drive space, and so on. So, so if you make them, so if you go to Best, depending on where you go, right? I shouldn't say Best Buy because you go to a store and if they want to really gouge you, they're gonna say, I'll upgrade you to Pro. You're gonna pay $100 more for sure. And then they'll try to sell you more RAM and drive with it. And that's your typical technical store. Yeah, so that we're gonna go with, upgrade edition must be the same or better. You shouldn't downgrade, right? I don't want to go from pro to home unless I want to save some money. But typically we go to equivalent or better in technology. Okay.
Is there a difference between a pro and a professional?
No, it's the same. Pro professional is the same. So the features for B, it says if the client select the operating system that have more feature for business application, you would recommend the Pro edition, right? And if you have Windows 10 Pro, you go to Windows 11 Pro, which is when 11 is like 10x. Now, if you really want to make it, if you want to optimize it, when I say optimizing is like using it to its maximum capability, right? Then we should upgrade the processor and the RAM. So hardware, so if you have more features in the software, you should consider long term, right? 5 years in, are they going to run into system being slowed down? If they install a bunch of application on it, is it going to be able to process, right? So RAM and processor is the essential key when you upgrade, okay? So if you want more features, think about like the hardware that you need to upgrade also. Okay. So there's an optional lab section, which is part B in your lab. You're not required to do it, and you probably cannot do it here because you need Rufus. And it's the software that you can use to create an image. So I wrote it into the lab. So in case you want to make a recovery bootable USB for your own PC at home, you can. You don't need a bunch of tools. You just need a little bit. And that software is tiny and it's free, right? So I wrote the instruction for you on how to do it. And so, have that USB. And then if your friend's computer crash, right, you stick that USB and boot to it, and you can go through the recovery process for their computer. So it is a helpful thing. But this is how you can go through the restore process. So I used to also be a backup technician for a pharmaceutical company, and I used to love it because I didn't have to deal with a lot of people. So backup technician would come in the time when the system is not the least used, I should say. So this is why if you are a late owl like me at 2 a.m. in the morning, I'm still trying to pay my bills. So sometimes I log into a website and I'm looking at my student loan or something, and I'll be like, But between like 1 to 3 a.m. is when you see that a lot of the servers start to kind of be slow. It's because they put it into the failover cluster and then they take the main server down, bless you, and they process like batch or backup or different things. Now, in order to recover your data, you have to back up your data. Backup is the first process. Understand? If I don't back up my data, where's the data I can recover from, right? So recovery is to put the data back. That means that if something happens to your system, if it's get wiped, if it's crashed, you have to pull the data that you have backed up maybe to a drive or to a remote server and putting it back. In Windows 10, this is how you go. So you go to settings, right? Or you can just search directly into recovery. But recovery is after backup. You understand? So if you cannot recover without a backup. In Windows system, when you create a backup, this is for tomorrow, it creates a backup file. So basically it converts everything that you have, the software or the files, and it puts it into one file. When you recover, it's going to take that file and unpack it. It's kind of like, oh, I wanted to have a backup food storage in case earthquake happens, right? You buy a bunch of food, you put it in boxes and security container, and you put it into your garage or wherever you put it. And then when you need it, you're going to have to take it out, right? Same thing. You are going to recover. And so if I simply don't know what to do, I just search for recover, right? You see how it pops up there? So everything is searchable. So you can click on recover. It takes you to control panel. And then it will tell you right here. What do you want, right? You can click these options, create a recovery drive, like what I told you that, that's an option. So you can go there to make a recovery drive, like a USB or another drive in your computer. You can also configure or open a system restore. So system restore is to put your system back to its previous state, right? I teach in security, I always talk about the state machine. And in computer science, we talk about that. Your computer is a state machine. Because if it's not, none of the files that you saved yesterday will be there. So it's kind of like yesterday, update my status, keep that status until today, right? Like, let's say that yesterday, right, I dyed my hair, so today I have a new hair, right? So that's your system would have the state that it was in. Now, when you restore, it just revert back to that state. Understand? So, now, so in order to do this, you can also go to settings. If I don't know where setting is, just search settings. Another way that you can access setting is right-click your Windows button, and setting is on the menu, right? So our other tools. So the Windows button, right-click, you have other options here, okay? But I can search for it. So if you go to settings, recovery, you just search for recovery, and then you can go through the process. So there are many ways to navigate through the system to access tools. Not everybody does it the same way, but Microsoft gives you many options to do that, many ways. So I always tell people, if you don't know, just search for it, and likely it's going to be there, and then just click the app. So it's easy. And in Linux and Apple, it's like that too, right? You don't have to remember where everything is, just search for it. The reason why they implemented this, because everybody used browser. And so that's why they put that there.
Like my friend's Linux is like not as complex as that one, or like very bare.
So I tell all my technical students in the upper classes, when you get to the server machine, it will not have a desktop. It will just have command line. So you have to be very, very good at commands, right? Because they always are like, oh, what command do I use? Because, I always start my class with Linux, and I'm like, push updates. And they're like, wait, what's update, right? So after a while, if you practice, you get used to it. Okay. So when you go through and if you do a reset, it's going to prompt you if you want to keep your files or if you don't want to keep your files. So the reset is kind of like manufacturer reset. It reverts it back to the original state. Remember that your system keeps some state, not all states, right? And it only have the state if you have the backup for it. Okay. So you tell it to save the state from yesterday, then it would revert back to that. But the manufacturer reset state is the first state that it has. It's always gonna be there. So typically they sell it now with like a small partition on your drive that has that. And your phone does too. So it's gonna revert back to those files for the state. Okay. Any question? Okay, let's talk about, go back to the partitions again. And, easiest way to remember is like room partitions, right? So drive partitions are a section of your drive. So there are, in Microsoft, there are two type of partitions, okay? The original by default also is your master boot record, your MBR. The reason why that it only has 4 primary partition and 1 active is that because the drives back in the day when this first was created was small drive, right? So MBR is kind of like this. It's like a house that they tell you that you can only have 4 room and a little bit of the like, let's say 4 bedroom and maybe like a small section of your house for something else, right? Like a den, okay? So MBR is like that, okay? But in the newer partition type, it's called GPT, not Chat GPT. You can have up to 128 partitions, 128 rooms. The reason why it's like this is because now you can have bigger drives, right? You can cut it up into different sections. You can also have many drives.
What does the GPT stand for? I know it's master boot record for a drive. It does not really matter.
It does if you take Microsoft certifications.
It's a boot partition.
Yeah. I'll show you where. So it talks about the installation type. I forgot to mention to you that there's unattended installation. This is very popular in a network environment. We don't go and install OS on an individual computer anymore. We do it as a group and we automate it, right? Like I can set it up. All of these computers are connected to a segment of my network, a section of my network. So I can send installation instructions and files to all of them at once, right? Because just imagine. So when I first came into the field, that's what we did. We did it manually, and it was just horrible. And then, they also use Ghost, which is like an imaging that's automated. So a clean install is like brand new drive or nothing on it, right? But if you do like other type of install, you might want to keep your file. Remember what we talk about multi-boot? So you can have multiple Windows version or Linux and Windows version. And they all accommodate that throughout. Here is MBR. So your master boot record was, and then GUID, graphical user interface, right? And it uses partition table. So basically the table track, because there's so many partitions. It's kind of like, you put a desk in front of your house to keep track of like who's staying in each room, right? Which room is which, right? So that's what this is. And so I think in my career, I have not seen a drive that partitions that many or have that many partitions. Also because, I don't work in a data center like that, right? But what you see is that you might have something like this in the larger server environment for enterprises, big companies. Okay. So in GPT, we talked about how there's 128 primary partitions, right? And when you create the partition today, you're going to see that it's primary. So for MBR, if you make it, they are going to be all 4 primary. So you can section it only 4 room and 1 active partition. So whichever partition that has the OS, it's going to become active. Okay. And it has a boot sector added to that. And then there's a thing called extended partition. So think of it like, okay, I have 4 room in my house, but now I got more people living there, right? I need to add another room, like maybe where the balcony used to be or the patio used to be, or I want to add another room like in the garage, right? So extended partition is kind of like that. It's not officially a logical partition. It is a logical partition, but it's not a primary in that it's just extended from the primary, right? So it's kind of like, how there's my living room and then there's a sliding door and I walk out, there's a patio. But let's say I removed the sliding door and I added another room there that's kind of added to the living room so someone can live there, right? Then that's like an extended partition. You see my analogy?
We call them deadly use.
My students are like, we see it, right? Because it's really hard to really logically imagine this, right? You can only correlate that to something that you kind of experience. So, all right. So you can only have 1 extended partition per drive. That's on the physical drive. It's kind of like you can only add 1 extended room in your house, right?
So even if the one that has 128,
Yeah.
you can only add 1.
Yeah. A lot of it is typically for the MBR. Yeah.
You don't need it.
So if you partition, like if you create a partition, it's gonna default to MBR because that's the first type. But Microsoft does let you choose. So if you don't choose, it's gonna make you use MBR.
But if you're running different Windows, like Windows 8.
Yeah, so there's only gonna be 1 booting at a time, right? Whichever booting is going to be active, but let's say I have 4 Windows operating system. They are all on 4 primary. And the same thing with these right here, right? So I can just throw them on the primary. It's kind of like 4 people living in the house, right? 4 rooms, right? You have 100 people living in the house, 100 partitions, 100 rooms, right? But only 1 person can speak at a time, which is like 1 person can boot, which is not the case, however. Okay, so if you helping a friend installing Windows 10 on the new PC, we're almost done with lecture. I keep it short so you can do the lab early today. Because it's longer. You're like, oh, 70 steps, 60 steps. Is she crazy? Can't get it done. It's fast. I'll walk you through it too. If you're helping a friend installing Windows 10 on a new PC, let's say that you go out and you buy a new computer or you build a new computer, because most computer that you buy, like a laptop or a pre-built system like a Dell, it has Windows on it. You don't have to go through and install, but let's say you build a computer, then you can install, right? What kind of this format would you choose? So you can do a quick format. And remember what I said, if you want security, use NTFS, right? But you can use exFAT for Windows 10 or 11. They do recommend you use NTFS so that way you can have encryption. You can have things like BitLocker. I forgot to talk about that one. But BitLocker only comes in the Pro edition. So you don't have it with Home because they're like, oh, home user, they might not need it. But BitLocker, I'm going to tell you, I don't really use it only because let's say that you encrypt a file, it's gonna ask you, do you want to save the key to your USB or print it out, right? So it's kind of like this. You want to lock your house when you leave, but then you're like, oh, I'm just gonna like put my key on the porch, right?
End of the month.
And then label it and say, here's my key, right? Or you can put your key in a jar and then put it, or an envelope put under your doormat. People can find that, right? So that's why I don't really use BitLocker. There's other tools you can use that's much more effective.
And you can forget the password too.
Well, the reason why they do that is like people forget the key because the key is very long. The key, it's like just imagine that you have like 100 keys to open that lock, right? People are not gonna remember all those characters they have to type. And the reason why they put it on the USB so you stick it in and it can open. But that's a downfall for sure. And encryption in itself is like, I do that in like one chapter in CIS-824A, but it could be like a whole course. So, question? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna kind of run through some of the things that like we didn't really touch on, but you should know. So I think the first couple of days, I already showed you how to use a command prompt. Microsoft calls it command prompt when everybody else call it command line, right? CLI, command line interface. And you can just find it using CMD, right? This is a way that you can interact with the system using command, which is instructions, right? For the low level to understand. Can you do it completely through command prompt? You can. If you are versatile enough. But Microsoft also came out with a thing called PowerShell. And PowerShell comes with all versions now. It used to only come with certain edition, but looks the same, right? Sometimes comes up blue, sometimes comes up black, but did you know that you can configure it, right? But anyway, PowerShell has more capability in that you can put in C-based, like Objective-C kind of language, and it has variable functions, all of that. So if you want to learn how to use PowerShell well, Microsoft has a whole repository on it. So you can just go PowerShell, right? And it doesn't have to be, commands. And you see here, Microsoft, they have blogs and also like tutorials on how to use it. So some of the commands is the same, like CD for, change directory or a set location. Some of them are different. And PowerShell commands have like get and set, very similar to what you see with like C programming, is that like you would obtain information by doing a get command, and then you would input information by doing a set command. If you are gonna get into IT, bless you, I highly recommend learning how to do PowerShell well, because you see a lot of jobs that require this, right? So if you want to become an administrator, right, stuff like that, and you can definitely obtain, so whatever you can click on the interface, you can also do in PowerShell. So this is a second component to command prompt. Command prompt is more limited to this, okay? But so you can find like resources from Microsoft, like see how there's a get command. So you can go through and run through their modules. So they have all kinds of stuff. And then you can practice. So they call it like so basically that's a function in the back. Anyway. So that's a little tip. Let's see what else I want to talk to you about. I think we did ipconfig a while back, but you have other, I put this on page 16, so you can also like, some of the commands you cannot do here because of your login limitation. So I'm gonna show you how, like, we're gonna get out of that. Come back to CMD. Okay, so if you want to follow, if you want to know what network you're logging in, you can do an NS lookup, right? And it tells me that I'm logged on to that server. Okay. And then we're gonna do an exit so we can go back to the regular prompt. We can also do trace route. I shouldn't say tracer. Trace route, and we're gonna follow. So your connection from here to a domain like YouTube, right? It's gonna show you like where your traffic goes. Okay. And so I need to go to youtube.com, which is that's the IP for the server right there, right? So it's leaving our CCD network. This is their router. And then it goes into the next part of the network, and then eventually service provider, and then eventually it's going to get to the LA location for the YouTube server. So traceroute, what it does is it's kind of like wherever it goes to, it reports back. So it's a little bit slower than your typical network type of connection, but you can see. So it's like putting a camera on a car and tell it to go from here to Corona, right? You're gonna see that every street that it turns, stuff like that. So that
Get that pop-up window
so you type CMD for command prompt
in the search.
in the search, yeah. And then you click on command prompt. So here we are, right? We're at YouTube. Now it tells you that, you know, there's 9 hops. So think of it like 9 freeway that it needs to get there. But technically it could be more or less. Microsoft only reports up to a certain amount, right? It tells you right here, sometimes it's over 30 hops. So hops are like your router, or autonomous systems that passes your traffic. But that's for the next class. Right? But so yeah. So I can open it again for you, right? And you can practice some of the stuff right here. So if you want to kill tasks, right? You know how you do Control Alt Delete and go to Task Manager. You can also kill a specific task. You can also do shutdown. So tracer, I did that. But trace route, trace RT, you just need to put the domain name like Google. Now, some domain, they don't let you follow, right? It will time out. The only reason why is they don't want, because this particular type of command it requires their system to report back to you. I tell my security students, all system call home. So, you know, if they see you, if you see them, they see you. So it's kind of cool. Now you can go home and, hey, you know, I can show you how you can get here from here to YouTube. And these are the traffic, the networks that you go over. Kind of like the city that you cross to go from here to LA. And is it different sometimes? Yes. Right? It's just dynamically passing. Okay, so that's one. And the table has more. So you can check it out, right? You can also check if your computer is connected. So this is a loopback address. So every system has a loopback address. It's just see itself as like, it's kind of like your house knows its own address. It's a boomerang address. So this is how you can see if there's reply, that means that your system is alive, right? And you can use its IP address. So I can ping them, watch. 251.60.90. Now, if they block it, oh, I put pint. Sorry, I have a typo. See, I can ping the router or server. But not all servers allows you to ping because you can ping someone to death, right? You can take them out that way. Yeah, so if you have like bots that like 5,000 bots pinging one system, it slows down that system. Yep. Denial of service. More to come in security class. Some cool stuff. All right. So if you want to troubleshoot your computer, check out like administrative tool, like especially if you have crash dump. Crash dump are like, blue screen of death. When you get that little sad face and blue screen, right? You should do a memory diagnostic right after that. It's typically is a RAM, a buffer overflow or RAM issue. Okay, either you low on RAM or it's not able to write to RAM quick enough. Okay.
So this section is not in today's notes.
Yes. Event viewer is really good for like things that are happening to your system. So you can search for event viewer for security students for Windows system. This is where they go. So if somebody attacked your system, you can find it here. So event viewer is it stores a log of everything that your system, all system keeps log of itself, right? Remember when I talk about state and status, right? So if I install a new file, it updates it here. If I delete a user, it updates it here. If somebody is attacking me, it shows that here. So in Windows system, it shows that on event in different areas. If you have an error when you're running applications, right? You see that there. I don't want to put too much information because my stuff goes to YouTube and I don't want to cause problem for RCCD. But anyway, and then there's another console that I want to show you, and then we'll take a short break before the lab. This is really important for managing your system. You can search for Computer Management Console, and remember that this tool only exists in the Pro Edition or the Enterprise Edition for the earlier Windows. So you can search for Computer Management Console, right? Just type Computer Management and it pops up. The cool thing about this is that you can create user accounts in here for the computer, right? You can in like control panel or other areas too, but this is way better. You can make a group of users or users. You can also check like how your system is performing. This is kind of like your task manager. If you install a new device, it also have device manager. That's another tool, right? Remember what we said, right? Every hardware that is acknowledged by Windows, it lists that here. And you can expand it. Like, here's my chicken feet. USB, right? So I have a bunch of ports that it shows logically. Okay. I also have task scheduler. So you know that antivirus uses a task scheduler. But I can schedule things like services to run, create a file. So I can automate some things with task scheduler.
For device manager, I think we are limited.
Yes, because you're not, you can view, but you cannot change. But at home, if you're an administrator, you can change, right? And then if you want to know what kind of services your system is running, you can also search for a services console, or it adds it into the computer management console. And it shows like from encryption to Bluetooth to, network, all the ports, all the devices, et cetera, and so on. But these areas are so important for IT and security people is because we have to find out what's wrong with your computer. Also, like if they attack your computer and take out some services, you need to know what that is, right? So incident response is really about that. Like after the incident, it's kind of like, you show up as a emergency person, the medical emergency team, and you have to find out what's wrong with that person. It's exactly that, but for the computer. So in a nutshell, any question? So I encourage you to go through, read the notes again. Microsoft has a series of certification, a little bit more pricey. They also have some of the lower level, entry level. So if you like Microsoft, so I was Microsoft certified and it had gotten me many jobs. So because everybody uses Microsoft. So I was an AD admin. I was a system admin, but I was also a network admin at some point. And then, my specialization is Active Directory, DNS, and other areas. So if you have a domain like google.com, you have to have a DNS. It doesn't necessarily tie to a web, but when you host a domain for web, you have to have a domain. And sometimes you logging on to RCCD, that's it, right? You saw that with NS lookup. Okay, so we're gonna stop the video.